Good evening to those who have joined us, and welcome to the third of 3 webinars hosted by American Bird Conservancy on dynamic forests for birds and wildlife in the Great Lakes region. My name is Linnea Rouse, and I'm the Private Lands Director with the American Bird Conservancy. And I'm joined today by several of my colleagues here at ABC in the Great Lakes region, as well as a few guest panelists from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So before we get started with our first presentation here, we just want to let you know how much we appreciate you taking the time at the end of your day to share this hour with us. So thank you. And just to recap here, the objective of this webinar series is to share the dynamic forest concept in the Great Lakes region, to discuss the benefits of active forest management for forest health, wildlife, and birds, and to share information on both technical and financial assistance available to private landowners or those working with private landowners interested in creating dynamic forest conditions on their lands in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So if you attended the first or one of the first 2 webinars in this 3-part series, you may recall that our first webinar focused on landscape disturbance and diversifying landscape structure through sustainable and ecological forestry practices. The second webinar focused on the benefits of young forest to a diversity of wildlife and white-tailed deer. And if you were unable to attend either of the first 2 webinars, we do have recordings available, and we will share links with a post-webinar email. Brief introduction to American Bird Conservancy. We are an international nonprofit bird conservation organization located in the Americas, dedicated to conserving wild birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. Our bird conservation strategic framework is summed up by this pyramid, and this shows how we approach bird conservation. So we emphasize achieving results on the ground and working in partnerships. In the Great Lakes region, our work largely focuses on finding and implementing solutions to bird population declines by working at landscape scale levels. We work across boundaries, and we form innovative partnerships to deliver habitat management and landowner incentives to achieve healthy, dynamic, sustainable forestry and forests at scale, which benefit birds and a diverse array of wildlife. Our team in the Great Lakes for our private lands initiatives includes Jack Haven and Dwayne Fogard in Minnesota, myself and Pat Weber in Wisconsin, and Michael Paling in Michigan. We all work with private landowners to work on bird habitat improvements on the ground across these 3 states. Tonight's 1-hour webinar will consist of 1 presentation by both Michael Paling and Jack Haven discussing opportunities for private lands dynamic forest management with a focus on golden-winged warblers and Kirtland's warblers. After the presentation, we will have a panelist session with 3 district conservationists from the Natural Resources Conservation Service and with ABC staff. We will ask you to enter your questions for the panelists or for the presenters into the Q&A feature, which you can see across the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. About 5 minutes before the end of the webinar time slot, we will open a poll to ask you to select if you wish to receive continuing education credits for this webinar. And this webinar is also being recorded, and we'll make that webinar available soon afterwards, and we'll send a link out to all registered participants. And with that, I will hand it over to Michael and Jack.
Thank you, Linnea. I am going to share my screen, and you guys now seeing it in presentation mode?
Looks good, Michael.
All right. Well, again, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's great to be able to share a little bit of information with all of you about how you can utilize some technical and financial assistance programs to benefit forest habitat on the landscape. If you have not yet heard, back in 2019, there was a research article in the journal Science that was published by American Bird Conservancy, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and several other partners that documented we have seen a steep decline in bird populations in North America. So since 1970s, we've lost almost 3 billion birds, and a lot of that has still been in eastern forest birds. And two of the forest birds that we are going to focus on in this presentation is the golden winged warbler and the Kirtland's warbler. And before I get into that, I wanted to just point out a couple opportunities that landowners could look into for programs to utilize during management on their property. The one that we are going to focus heavily on today is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, but there are also some other opportunities that I think it would be very advantageous for landowners to look into, such as the other programs from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, such as the Environmental Quality Incentives Program or the Conservation Stewardship Program. There's also the DMAP program that we heard about in our last presentation. There's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Private Lands Program, and Wisconsin has their Young Forest Partnership. In Michigan, we have the Forestry Assistance Program, and across the 3 states, we have local soil and water conservation districts that you can reach out to for any kind of management, whether that's just forestry help or if you are looking for any other environmental or natural resources assistance. So as I said, we're going to focus a lot on the Regional Conservation Partnership Program today. So what is this RCPP? And that's what I'll refer to it here on out as RCPP. RCPP overall, it's a national program, and as the NRCS states that it is a partner-driven approach to conservation that funds solutions to natural resource challenges on agricultural land. And they do consider forest land as agricultural land. They look at timber as a crop. It is something that is grown and can be harvested and provides a product. It is a great opportunity for partners such as American Bird Conservancy to be able to bring in some funding to help private landowners get projects done on the ground. In 2014, ABC first applied for this RCPP and we were awarded, and our focus with that was really helping habitat for the golden winged warbler across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. With that first round of RCPP, we had some good success so far. We were able to put new acres on the ground, just a little under 7,000 acres for the golden winged warbler, specifically utilizing best management practices laid out in the golden winged warbler BMPs. Research is showing that we are having benefits, or we are seeing benefits to the golden winged warbler from utilizing these BMPs and putting the acres on the ground. And with putting acres on the ground, we also have an aspect of outreach and education that is just like this webinar. We are trying to spread the information about doing good habitat work for wildlife species that are in need of assistance. So it has been a wild ride so far, I'll say. To give you an idea of where we are doing this work specifically at, this map lays out what we now have in our second round of RCPP. We have all the counties across the states in pink are eligible for practices that are for the golden winged warbler, and all the counties that have the crosshatch marks are practices that are eligible for practices for the Kirtland's warbler. And at this point, we are going to start to delve into a little more specifics about what each of these birds really need for their habitat. And to do that, I am going to pass it on to my colleague Jack to discuss the information about the golden winged warbler.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so globally, the golden winged warbler, its population has declined roughly 70%, and that number's from 1966 to 2010. And this is largely in part due to habitat loss from land conversion, encroachment from invasive species, and aging forests, and that's due to suppression of natural disturbances such as suppression of wildfires and beaver trappings. And with this lack of disturbance, we're seeing less young forest and early successional habitat. And that's the habitat golden winged warblers use for breeding. And so in our golden winged warbler projects, we're looking for roughly 5 acres minimum for a harvest. And within this, we'll leave 5 to 15 overstory trees per acre, or also we can do quarter to half acre legacy or reserve patches. And this habitat, it not only benefits golden winged warblers, but it benefits American woodcock, ruffed grouse, eastern whippoorwill, as well as various other species, which Pat mentioned in our last webinar, but that's white-tailed deer, black bears will use this, and snowshoe hare as well. And so historically, the golden winged warbler population, it was connected all the way from the Great Lakes region to Appalachia, but now those are 2 disjunct populations. And us being in the Great Lakes region, we're focusing on the Great Lakes golden winged warbler population. And so in Wisconsin and Michigan, you can see they've had a slight annual decline in population, while Minnesota, they have stayed relatively stable. And ABC's goal with the help of partners is to increase the global population by around 50% in the next 30 years. And the research is showing that the habitat we are creating, like Michael had mentioned earlier, that habitat we're creating with private landowners, it is being used by golden winged warblers. And so for us to reach this 50% goal, it's going to take work with federal lands, state lands, and private landowners as well. So here on the left, you can see a fairly mature tag alder stand that's pretty overgrown. And tag alder can get so thick that there will be just no understory growth, and that results in a lack of diversity. And so with our projects, we'll have a skid steer come in, and that can grind up and mulch the alder. And as you can see in the middle, immediately the results do look pretty rough, but this habitat can rebound pretty quick, and you can see results even in that immediate year. It can look like what it looks like on the right. And so this early successional habitat we're trying to create for the golden winged warbler, that young shrub, or what we'll talk about in the next slide, aspen, that young habitat is where the golden winged warblers will put their nests, and that helps protect them from predators. And as I mentioned earlier, with the residual trees that we leave behind, as you can see on the picture on the right, we do that because golden winged warblers will use that, or at least the males, and during the breeding season, they will use that as perching trees to call out for mates. And with those residual trees, we try to make those either be oaks or maples instead of aspen, just because oaks and maples tend to be a little bit more wind resilient than aspen can be. So, and oaks are very good wildlife trees as well. And so here, this is kind of a walkthrough of timber harvest, which is the other primary practice that we do. And I didn't mention this on the last slide, but the alder shearing or hazel shearing, those tend to be practices that we do a lot of in Wisconsin and Michigan. where in Minnesota, we tend to do a lot of timber harvests. And so we will come out, look at your property, look at your, what will probably be a mature forest stand, and then you'll get signed up, as Michael will explain in a little bit, and you'll have a logger come out and they'll come and harvest your timber. And again, immediately it looks a little rough, but as you can see in the bottom right, that aspen regen, it comes back pretty quick. I would guess that aspen's around 1 to 2 years old and it's already 5 or 6 feet tall. So that the ugliness that can happen immediately, it gets covered up pretty quick by the aspen. So, and you can also see we like to have these practices next to some mature forests, and that habitat is used by the golden warbler fledglings. Once they leave their nest, that's where they'll go and forage for food. So, yeah.
And at this point, I'm gonna take back over to kind of talk a little bit more about the Kirtland's warbler. And I'll say that the Kirtland's warbler is talked about a lot in Michigan. It is a fairly well-known bird across the professionals. So, but for anybody that is not as familiar with this bird and its habitat that it requires, it is a very picky bird. It really needs a lot of that young forest habitat too, but instead of the alder or young deciduous forests, it needs young jack pine and a lot of it. So when we are working in habitat or trying to create habitat for the Kirtland's warbler, we're really looking at large landscapes, large tracts of young jack pine, or trying to create that. So 80 plus acres is what we are trying to do with our projects. And if the Kirtland's warbler has its preferred way, it really likes to have even larger tracts to nest in, so 200 or plus acres. So sometimes it's a little bit of a difficulty finding the right projects in the right location for good habitat work. To add on to that, we also want to try and make our projects as close to suitable habitat, existing suitable habitat as possible, because it just makes our impact on the landscape just a little bit bigger and a little bit easier to work with. And as Jack kind of mentioned, for some of the habitat or some of the other species that utilize habitat for golden winged warbler, while we are trying to do habitat work targeting a couple birds specifically, it's not just habitat that's going to benefit those birds. So young jack pine habitat can also be great for spruce grouse, deer, turkey, and foxes, and several, not just several, many migratory bird species. And with all of that, as I've mentioned, that the Kirtland's warbler is a very picky bird. Several decades ago, it was almost extinct. We were down to 167 total pairs globally, and it was listed on the Federal Endangered Species list, but it has now been removed from the list back in 2019, thanks to all of the conservation efforts that have taken place over the past several decades. And with that, we can't stop this work now, because if our efforts are halted now, there's a high likelihood that the Kirtland's warbler will go back on the endangered species list, and we don't want the population trends to decline. We want to keep them going the way they are. And our efforts now, we really want to expand their breeding range, which is primarily in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. We want to expand them up into the upper peninsula, as well as over into Wisconsin, and we also have some partners that are doing work in Ontario as well. So the typical management that we are seeing or working on for creating habitat for this bird is harvesting mature older jack pine stands and replanting them. Uh, as you can see on the picture in the bottom right there, we have an image of a landscape that was planted in what we call the opposing weave fashion, where there are small diamond shaped areas where are left open for the Kirtland's warbler to be nesting, foraging and around. And as I've mentioned before, our goal with trying to expand them out of the northern lower peninsula, we're really focusing heavily on the upper peninsula of Michigan. We have several areas that are targets. So for example, Baraga Plains or the Duck Lake Fire area in the eastern UP are, well, I should say the Baraga Plains area is in the western UP, the Duck Lake Fire in the eastern UP, and a couple other areas in Wisconsin. We have some projects underway at the moment. Get my computer to move. So just a couple images to give a little bit more of a visual perspective of what we're trying to start with in terms of Kirtland's habitat. You have that older, mature jack pine forest that has reached towards the end of its lifespan. Harvest it, or if we have areas that already have been harvested and there is not as much regeneration coming back, there's not as much trees growing as we want, we can, like we have in the middle photo there, we can come through and plant the whole area into jack pine. The Kirtland's warbler needs a pretty dense area for planting, so we want to be able to plant it at a high density so that it gets to be like the image on the right there. And with these programs, we always have to think about it in terms of how is it not just meeting what we are trying to do on habitat for these bird species, but how can they also link to common landowner goals? And this slide here just lists a couple of the goals that we hear the most. And by far the most that landowners mention when we ask them, what do they want? What are they trying to do on their land? They want to do good for habitat. They have, many times it's for game species, so they are using the property for hunting. Other times they really just want to do good habitat management. They want to be good stewards of the land. And sometimes I find it kind of interesting, or maybe not surprised is what I was when I first heard several of my landowners that I've been working with. We had projects for mowing down their mature tag alder, and they were just happy to have it mowed, have it gone. They were just happy to be able to use a little bit more of their property than having uh, a huge stand of tag alder that they couldn't even walk through. And then, of course, the finances or the financial incentives for these programs is also really nice. It's a great way for landowners to be able to afford to do this work because it's not always affordable. It's not cheap work. So being able to help landowners on the funding side of things is essential in getting the work done. With programs, though, they are not fast all the time. These programs are not going to happen overnight, and it is something to kind of prepare yourself for, is understand the timeline or the layout of how these programs work and how they're going to progress. So this slide here just lays out the 9-step planning process that the Natural Resources Conservation Service uses when we are working with landowners and going through the application process of getting some financial assistance as well as technical assistance. And the way I look at this process is, you can see here, steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the steps when we are out on the property. We go out and we visit the land. We are taking notes on what tree species are out there. We're taking an inventory of density, soil types, conditions on the land, getting information and becoming familiar with your property and how we can potentially help you on your property. And then we move into steps 5, 6, and 7, which is where we are uh, creating a plan of action. We are trying to put information that we gathered before into a tangible plan that you are going to have impacts of acres on the ground and then be able to implement it. And then we end off, of course, by actually doing the work. That is the whole end goal, is we want to have good impact of acres on the ground and be able to have the impact that we are trying to receive. So as I mentioned, the programs are not going to work super fast, but it's a work in progress. So it could be several months, it could be a year, depending on when you initially apply for the programs. And through our RCPP program, these are the practices that we are primarily focusing on, as Jack and I have both mentioned and talked about. With our primary practices, the early successional habitat development, mostly for either tag alder or hazelbrush or young aspen stands, where we bring in skidster mulchers, or forest stand improvement, which is a lot more for timber harvesting of older deciduous forests. While those are our main practices, there are also supporting practices as well. So prescribed burning, invasive species treatment, native grass plantings, and tree plantings are also things that we can utilize through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And before I end off with this presentation, if you have not gotten enough information about either ABC or the NRCS programs, or you just want to see more of Dwayne Fogard from our first presentation, we do have a video on YouTube that Dwayne helped with a landowner he worked with. And this video is actually really great as well, to give the perspective from a landowner's view as well. So if we have not shared that in the chat yet, we will be sharing the link shortly so that you all will have access to that slide. But that is the end of our presentation portion of this webinar. And from here, we are going to transition into a panel discussion with our partners at the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we have a local district conservationist from each of the 3 states, from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And just a quick slide to show who we have from where. At this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen in just a second, and also transfer everything over to Jack, who is going to lead the charge in asking questions of not just our NRCS partners, but also ABC staff that we have all heard from before. If any of you on the webinar have questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them as we are chatting through our questions that Jack is answering, and we will be able to include those questions and have those answered throughout this as well. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing And Jack, I believe I will let you take it.
Yep. Yep. Thanks, Michael. Yeah. So first question. This is for the NRCS staff with us. What's the incentive of RCPP and other cost share programs, especially through the NRCS?
So I feel like all these cost share programs, RCPP, EQIP, and CSP, all the ones that were mentioned before, provide a unique opportunity to allow private landowners to manage their lands to meet their objectives. Sometimes that objective is to have their land be more profitable, and we're just alleviating the risk associated with trying something new. But for the golden winged warbler and managing those properties, you're probably not going to get a lot of return on investment other than the wildlife habitat from shearing alder. You can't package up the alder stumps and sell them and that kind of stuff. So I feel like the real incentive is providing that habitat and allowing landowners to invest in their property to benefit the population of those not critically endangered, of those birds and their critical habitat out there, especially in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan.
Yeah, and I feel like I agree, wholeheartedly with Nick. It's really just to incentivize people to do something that they wouldn't to be necessarily know what to do, so we can provide that technical assistance as well as the financial assistance to create more habitat where they might not have done that through a timber harvest. For example, the early successional or that young forest habitat.
Yeah, and Michael touched on it in his presentation as well. Many of these habitat improvement projects that are prescribed do cost significant amounts of money to implement. And without programs such as these, many landowners or land users would not have the means to implement those projects without these programs that are available to basically provide the greater good for wildlife habitat across our country.
Awesome. All right. So another question that we had is, how does a landowner get started, either with RCPP or another program through the NRCS?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that folks can connect with partners involved in these programs, whether it be American Bird Conservancy staff or NRCS staff. NRCS is lucky to be able to have a presence in most counties in the area where this habitat work is targeted. So most counties have what's called a local USDA service center where NRCS staff are located, and in many cases it's as simple as a quick Google search to find your local USDA service center, and you can call or stop into those offices and get connected with your regional American Bird Conservancy forester to start having a conversation about potential for habitat improvement projects.
And NRCS is, partners directly with the local conservation districts. So, any county has a local conservation district, and so folks can call them, and then that local conservation district can then point that person to the right, either the forester or a wildlife biologist, or maybe even a state program like the DMAP, that kind of stuff.
in Wisconsin. So we have all those opportunities. And then in addition, we have kind of a vibrant community of Pheasants Forever biologists and Rough Grouse Society biologists that are quite often co-located in NRCS offices. So private landowners will reach out to those folks through those societies. Maybe you're a member of Pheasants Forever or Rough Grouse Society, you reach out to that biologist, and you're actually probably coming right into one of our offices to begin with for that process.
Yeah, because everyone's like co-located, you know, kind of hanging out in the same office.
So we have a couple of questions here from the audience. One of the questions is, do either of these species, golden-winged warblers and Kirtland's warblers, inhabit southern Wisconsin, south of the tension zone? And I can take a stab at answering that. The tension zone typically for golden-winged warbler is referred to where the range of golden-winged warbler and blue-winged warbler overlap. Blue-winged warblers are very closely related to golden-winged warblers and have been, they do hybridize with golden-winged warblers. In the Appalachian range specifically, the blue-winged warblers has been sort of inhabiting the same types of habitat as golden-winged warblers, and that can be a part of the cause for the population decline, but not necessarily as big of one as the habitat change or habitat loss. In southern Wisconsin, that's where blue-winged warblers would be found, not golden-winged warblers, and we're focusing our efforts for the young forest habitat management in the northern parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan for that reason. So they're really focusing on the core golden-winged warbler range there. For Kirtland's warblers in the 3 states, as Michael said, there's a core population in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. There are some very small outer populations in parts of Wisconsin, in parts of the upper peninsula of Michigan, but they're very disjunct, and that's where ideally, as part of the conservation effort for the species, we're trying to support satellite populations. So should something catastrophic happen in the northern part of lower Michigan, with habitat aging out of that specific age group for Kirtland's warblers, for example, there will be other populations that can help support that. Another question is that there are some pretty specific bird species, as I just mentioned, discussed in this webinar, which is in the northern parts of these 3 states. And this person asked about replacing ash trees that have died on their property, which is located in Door County. So kind of in the peninsula going into Lake Michigan from Wisconsin. They're not focused on a specific species, but would like to enhance their land for native Door County bird species. Are there programs to support that? And maybe one of the NRCS folks could take that.
Sure. So yeah, there's definitely some opportunities there. I would say that person should definitely contact their local office, which is going to be out of Luxembourg, Wisconsin. So in Kewaunee County, that is where the main office that also services Door County is. Always just start with a site visit with a professional. Perhaps NRCS might invite a DNR forester along as well to gauge the severity of the ash decline there. There's not much we're gonna be able to do about the emerald ash borer if it's taken root there, but moving your forest to different species would probably be the best way to go about that, whether it's harvest and replanting, or maybe you have some residual stock there that you can release through other type of marking and harvest processes there. So.
Yeah, it looks like we have one other question that came in. Why don't we go ahead and answer this one live as well? The question is, what kinds of interest has NRCS had specifically to Kirtland's warbler habitat creation? What land types are typically targeted for conversion to early successional jack pine? Let me take a stab at it from an ABC perspective, and then NRCS folks feel free to jump in. So, the jack pine ecosystem has been created on very sandy and dry soils. and has been influenced, over thousands of years by fire. And when you look at a soil map of kind of the Great Lakes, you'll see kind of where the glaciers have left back these huge amounts of sand deposits, and it's within those ecosystems where we see the biggest opportunity for the Kirtland's breeding restoration. And I'm not aware if there's any other specific Kirtland's program, but with this RCPP that we have, we are providing resources and technical support through ABC to expand the Kirtland's habitat, as Linnea mentioned, either in the northern lower of Michigan or in these potential sites that we have within Adams County of central Wisconsin, kind of the central sands, also in the northeast sands of Marinette County and a little bit in Florence County. And then also even as you get into the northwest part of the state, Douglas County and into just the edge of Minnesota. So the RCPP does have funding available. And as Linnea mentioned, we do have a couple of landowners interested. And if you're a landowner out there and you feel like your property fits kind of the specifics that I mentioned, please reach out to us and we can go from there.
And Pat, there's a related question that came into the chat. A landowner has 8 acres of mature jack pine in Waushara County, which is just south of Adams County, sort of south central Wisconsin. Would that be beneficial to manage for the Kirtland's warbler?
It was 8 acres. I didn't see the question.
It's in the chat.
Oh, okay, in the chat. If you're adjacent to a couple hundred acres of jack pine that's being managed, and absolutely, one of the things that research has shown us with Kirtland's warbler is that they have evolved to be attracted to very large expansions of young jack pine, historically created through fire, and so it's always great, regardless of the size of your property, to manage it for wildlife, but specifically for Kirtland's, if you just have a very small area that's not adjacent to a larger area, you probably won't have Kirtland success. But again, one never knows.
I think one thing I'd like to add on to that real quickly is, even though you may not have a lot, you may not have the amount of acres that a Kirtland's warbler needs. Does your neighbors have additional habitat that can be added on? So look beyond your own political boundaries of your property lines and think about the landscape.
So I guess to piggyback onto what Pat was saying as well, I've worked with several landowners who were maybe disappointed to find out that their property wasn't maybe a good candidate for managing for golden wings. However, we still went through that planning process and came up with some pretty solid recommendations to benefit woodcock and grouse on those sites, and ended up doing some very successful projects with maybe other species in mind. And who knows, maybe a golden wing will show up there because we're kind of in that core area as well.
Alrighty, well, here's another question. How much funding will I get in an RCPP project, and how is that funding determined?
So that's a really good question. And of course, the answer is always going, to a question like that, the answer is always going to be, it depends. But there are many different types of practices that can be implemented through the recommendations of your ABC forester, and that may be applicable to several different programs, as Michael talked about in his presentation. And each program is structured differently, and within each program, the practices that are recommended are structured differently. And the costs that are, or the financial assistance that is provided through these programs are based on average costs to implement those various practices across the Lake States region. So that can vary significantly depending on exactly what practices are being implemented. Typically, these programs are targeted to provide 50% of the average cost to implement that type of a practice in our region. Now, it doesn't always work out that way exactly, but that's what they're typically targeted to do, specifically with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, you know, during that planning process, that 9-step, once a practice has been decided and alternatives, and you have that solid plan, at that time, you'll know what that cost share is before you actually sign an agreement to move forward. So that information is available once those practices are decided upon and the scenarios that are chosen for that plan. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to do this and you're going into it blindly. It's a lot of communication with the forester, the planners, the biologists, and RCS staff.
And
There's,
Nick,
okay, go ahead, Tom.
Nick and Misa, you can give your perspective on this too, but in Minnesota, I would say that we have had very good success funding the projects that are beneficial to golden warbler habitat through these programs. But these programs are all competitive, so a certain amount of money is allocated to these programs and to these areas or states each year. So there's a limited amount of funding, so not every applicant is guaranteed to receive funding either. But we've had a real good success, specifically with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, getting a high percentage of the applicants funded each year.
Yeah, for sure. Right, Michael? I mean, we've had good success in Michigan.
So I would echo that sentiment. I would say so far, I'm over after application, given a 24-month period. I know that can sound like a long time, but that goes by in a blink of an eye. Every project that's come through that has been eligible for the program. So we've been evaluated, determined that the project, that's the scope of the project in place, is going to benefit the targeted species through RCPP, has eventually been funded in my local area.
There's a related question about financial assistance. Is there financial assistance available for large corporate landowners? There are several in Marquette County, Michigan. And the question is, does ABC or NRCS have programs that would fit with large corporate lands?
So I guess we work with non-industrial private landowners. So to me, I guess it would depend on the ownership of that property in Marquette. But if it is privately held and they meet our eligibility requirements for the land and for adjusted gross income, and there's habitat to be done, then yeah, it's a possibility for sure.
Alrighty, so does the NRCS have a wasp release program for the ash forests that have been newly infected by emerald ash borer?
Not that I'm aware of currently. We have scenarios for biological controls for invasive species of that nature, but I'm not aware of anything to date specifically for that.
All right. So what if I can't get my RCPP project completed due to issues outside of my control, such as maybe the ground's not freezing or my logger wasn't able to get out this year? What happens then?
That one's been on the top of my mind here lately. We did not get good frost in my part of Wisconsin. So each project's evaluated independently. But right now I've been going through a process. This is getting into the weeds, but issuing waivers to extend things for another 12 months. Anytime that a practice is not getting implemented and it's outside of the participant's control, NRCS is going to be working with that producer to extend the contract, give it another chance, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like NRCS realizes that there's fluctuation in the timber market and there's obviously fluctuation in weather. So to me, as long as there's this, intent to proceed and willingness to proceed and everyone is still engaged, that we certainly submit those waivers to extend.
Yeah, and also during the planning process, when these projects are being evaluated and set up, generally, at least in Minnesota, they're sort of planned to take place over what can be a fairly lengthy period of time, maybe even a couple of years, especially if there's multiple facets of a project. So you might have a project that's planned to take place over even 2 or 3 years. And if the planner is doing a good job of foreseeing how a particular project might go based on previous experience, I think that we try to allow for plenty of time for projects to get implemented, knowing that it's very common to run into weather issues or things that or contractor issues or things that just may delay projects.
Equipment issues. I mean, there's just a number of things that, you're like, oh, I haven't, yeah, that's a new one. But yeah, I feel like, NRCS has set aside the funding. We've kind of agreed that, this is a good project. We want it to be successful. So we certainly will do everything that we can to keep that project going and to give those contractors and customers the time to do it.
All right, so our next question's for all 3 DCs. Can I be in this RCPP program if I am already in another state or local forestry program?
So from a Minnesota perspective, our federal programs align nicely with state and local programs. I'm not aware of any few state and local programs that would conflict with these farm bill programs. From a farm bill standpoint, it's not necessarily anything that is would preclude you from participating in the farm bill programs unless you're receiving federal funding for the same project at the same time. So in Minnesota, we have very many customers who are enrolled in the state's Sustainable Forest Incentive Act, or the Managed Forest Tax Classification, or numerous other programs along those lines. So most programs work together quite nicely, at least here in Minnesota.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel the same way with Michigan NRCS. I feel like what we're trying, to me, it's based on what's going on the land. And so these are very land specific. And so what we don't want is like, someone who's doing things on the same thing multiple times. And that would just be at a local level.
Wisconsin's very much the same, closely aligned. The biggest program we have is the Managed Forest Law. It's a state incentive tax program. When we are doing especially forestry work, so taking alder out of the equation, but timber stand improvement or shearing of aspen, we are definitely going to be working with our DNR foresters to ensure that their harvest management plans align. I have yet to have one where we couldn't find the common ground on it, but we're definitely, I don't want to say seeking permission, but just making sure that the DNR foresters understand the project that we're hoping to do, or the landowner's hoping to do, and seeking permission to make sure that we're not going to conflict with the tax law program on those acres.
Correct. Yeah. And Michigan also has a similar program, the Commercial Forest Act, and then the Qualified Forest Program. And here in the north, or the UP in the northern lower of Michigan, we have Conservation District Foresters, or FAP Foresters. So we have that program. So we're always working closely with our state and local partners to make sure that, yeah, we're all on the same page.
Taking a note of the time, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll for the continuing education credits. And while that's going, we do have another question about emerald ash borer. As EAB emerald ash borer spreads through black ash forests in Minnesota, will these programs be expanded to include biocontrols, insecticides, or silvicultural practices? And maybe Dwayne can touch on this a little bit because of some of the other project work we've been doing in Minnesota. And then the question also includes, do we see the loss of these black ash forests destabilizing the population of golden-winged warblers in Minnesota?
Yeah, I'll see if I can answer that. Well, these programs are aimed specifically at golden-winged warblers and Kirkland's warblers. So, I mean, I would not expect them to be expanded to address, you know, emerald ash borer kind of things. There certainly could be other programs that do that, insecticides and stuff like that. That would, you know, to do that on that kind of scale would be pretty expensive and would probably meet a lot of public opposition, I would think. So I don't know how realistic that is, but there is other things that are being done for EAB. There's several groups that are doing diversification plantings. We've got a grant through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative where we're doing some diversification plantings in black ash stands. And, you know, depending on who owns the land, you know, the DNR is doing various management things with land they own, and you know, maybe Tom can address this a little more, but, you know, NRCS does help private landowners that have, that are concerned about EAB with doing, you know, kind of resilience treatments to try to, you know, increase your age class diversity or increase your species diversity to try to, you know, at least reduce the impact of EAB. As far as EAB impacting golden-winged warblers, you know, I think golden-winged warblers don't really use that kind of habitat for nesting, but, you know, they probably raise their young in there to some extent. But, you know, it's hard to really predict what that would happen. I guess my guess would be that, you know, it won't impact golden wings hugely, but, you know, if 1 million acres of black ash all die, you know, that probably will impact them to some extent, and then there'll be a reduced places for them to raise their young after they hatch. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. And I don't know if anyone else from NRCS wants to jump in, that's fine. We are at 8 p.m. Eastern time, 7 p.m. Central. So I think if anyone has final thoughts on that, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the webinar and we'll be sure to answering any lingering questions with our follow-up email. And please also, if you are listening in still, fill out our post-webinar survey, which will just take a couple minutes, and that'll be sent via email.
I would like to give a final general thought. I guess when we discuss all of these programs available for all this type of habitat work, it can seem fairly daunting when you first kind of hear about it. And it's can be hard to feel like you are confident enough to navigate these programs and know what you want. When you maybe knock on an office door or walk into an office or give a phone call. But I would just encourage the participants to not really worry about trying to navigate this program world. That is our job as USDA staff to help you figure out what program might fit best for you based on your goals and based on the recommendations that might come from the forestry and habitat experts. So I just encourage you to take advantage, take a look at some of these opportunities and work with the staff that are out there to help, and we'll do our best to make it easy on you. So.
Yeah, Tom, that's a great point. And I would just say, come on down. And in Wisconsin, there's always confusion. It's like, if I get into government programs, does that mean I have to open my land up for hunting? And no, that's you're crossing a lot of wires. And I bet you I get that question 2 times a week here lately. So completely separate of that kind of stuff. Don't be a stranger, and we're here to help.
Yeah, please call us. Yeah, just call us.
And with that, I think we'll wrap up here. We will be sending out a follow-up email. We appreciate all of your time that you took out this evening to listen in on our webinar. We'll make sure to share our ABC Private Lands Foresters contact information in our email, because we can connect you with your local NRCS office and also discuss habitat opportunities with you if you are a landowner or if you work with landowners. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.